All right. I think it's about 10:45, so I'm going to get started just a tad bit early so there's more time for questions at the end. First of all, thanks for coming out to hear my talk on DNS over HTTPS. Also, I want to thank Black Hills and the whole Wild West Hackin Fest group for giving me the opportunity to do my first talk. So I'm Marcus. This is going to be about DNS over HTTPS. We're going to cover the attacker and defender side. So first of all, why am I here? Actually, about a year ago, I attended my first security conference, which was Wild West Hackin Fest, and it was pretty much during the conference that the RFC for DNS over HTTPS got finalized. I don't know if you caught, but Paul Vixie did a really great talk at this a year ago. We talked about his hatred of DNS over HTTPS. And in the following weeks, some really interesting tool sets were released by some researchers abusing DNS over HTTPS. So I pretty much got home from this conference and started using those tools and looking at how we can defend it. And I was surprised that there weren't more resources, more generalized about how DNS over HTTPS works, how attackers can abuse it, and how defenders can catch it. And I think you'll see that it's pretty easy to use as an attacker, and for a defender, it can actually be quite hard. So I'm going to cover the basics of DNS over HTTPS, how it works. Hopefully you have an understanding of how the protocol actually works. We're going to go over use of DNS over HTTPS by testers, so how you can use existing tools out there to basically set up C2, and how it's actually used today by malware in the wild. We'll look at a couple examples. Then we're going to go over some detection and prevention techniques, at least what is possible. And I'm not going to be talking about whether or not DNS over HTTPS is a good idea or a bad idea. The fact of the matter is pretty much that it's out there. I'm happy to talk about ethics and privacy implications and whatever else afterwards, or you can go seek out Paul Vixie and talk to him about it. So what is DNS over HTTPS? My favorite way to think about it is basically as layers. It's DNS queries on the inside, wrapped up in HTTP transactions, wrapped up in SSL. You can look at that diagram I put over there because it's easy to think of them as Russian dolls, right? With the outermost layer being your TCP, which is what you're going to see in Wireshark, whatever else. SSL happening underneath that. If you're actually decrypting the SSL, you'll see HTTP, just standard get post. And then in there, you'll see DNS either set up in UDP wire format, so binary, or a JSON format. It's mostly run by Google and Cloudflare. There's lots of other providers out there, but Google and Cloudflare are the important ones, mostly because of their position to be trusted providers, so most people aren't going to care about traffic to Google and Cloudflare. And it's available today in Firefox and Chrome as a setting, and they're both slowly rolling out, turning it on by default. So you're going to start seeing this traffic on your network. So this is a basic idea of how the transaction works. The first thing you have to do is Bootstrap. So you're going to see a query to either cloudflare-dns.com, dns.google, a couple of the other providers, so that you can get the IP address. Then you'll see a DNS over HTTP request out to cloudflare-dns.com. That's going to be over SSL. So if you're not decrypting that, all you're going to see is SSL to cloudflare-dns.com. The Cloudflare DNS server is going to go up and do its normal DNS things. It's going to recurse up to whatever the authoritative name server is, get the IP address, bring it back, and then send that down to you in its SSL response, right? Once you have that IP address, then you can go ahead and connect out to example.com or your malware website or whatever it is you want to do. I want to make sure to cover the differences between DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS. Some people get those mixed up. DNS over TLS is working only on port 853. That's its standard destination port. It's very easily blockable, right? You can just block port 853 and not have to worry about it. And it was designed from the start to work at the host level. The operating system was supposed to work with this. It's basically going to follow all of our current DNS control mechanisms and paradigms we currently use. DNS over HTTPS was pretty much specifically designed to subvert that stuff. So it's going to go over port 443. It's designed to be indistinguishable from standard HTTPS traffic. And it was designed from the start to work at the browser level. So before I cover how it can be abused by attackers, I think it's important to understand how it's currently used by defenders, because these are the things that attackers are trying to subvert. So many, if not all, organizations are running private DNS servers on-prem. This is to do stuff like log DNS requests, and also to be able to resolve private addresses. So if you're running an internal website on an internal IP address, you need to have a DNS server that can resolve that for you. That can only be done internally. Cloudflare will not be able to answer those DNS requests. It'll represent a huge loss of control. So like I mentioned, for resolving internal IPs, it won't be able to do that. Also, a lot of people are doing a lot of their blocking with DNS. So you can do what's called sinkholing domains, and that's just saying, I don't want you to go to badsite.com. I'm going to give you an IP address that doesn't resolve. Also, it's used all the time for network troubleshooting, threat hunting, and incident response. If you want to learn more about those, I actually think Paul is giving a whole workshop on threat hunting with DNS in like 25 minutes. So lots of examples there. So the basics of how this can be used by attackers. There basically are two major uses. The first one would just be hiding your DNS queries. So this will allow you to get around any DNS-based filtering. It'll also not show up in any DNS-based logging. So this can make your command and control much more flexible, because if you're doing it domain-based, you can change IPs as fast as you want. And you can also use stuff like fast flux DNS, which basically is a technique letting you respond with new IP addresses all the time and lots of IP addresses, so you can cycle through tons of IPs, very difficult to block. The other technique is DoH tunneling. This is basically DNS tunneling, but now over an encrypted channel and going to a DoH provider. So it's going to be traffic directly to Google, it'll be traffic directly to Cloudflare, it's encrypted by default, basically taking away all of the downsides of DNS tunneling as it's used today. So you won't be able to see any traffic between the client and the C2 domain. All that a network observer will be able to see is traffic from the client to the DoH provider like Cloudflare or Google. It's essentially easy but very slow domain fronting to a very trusted domain. So I've got a quick example on that. Basically the way it works is you would send a request for a subdomain at attacker.com to your DoH provider. In this example, I just base64 encoded hello world, but that's just to show you can encode whatever you want to a subdomain. The Cloudflare DNS server will then go back up to your controlled name server. Your name server can do whatever it wants with that ASCII text it's receiving and send a response, usually in a TXT record, because TXT records can have 255 characters of whatever you want in there. Cloudflare will receive that and send it down to your client. Like I mentioned, it is slow. You're limited to 63 characters per label in a DNS request. So that's between the periods in a DNS request. And the response is limited to 255 characters. So if you're trying to move big files, it will go quite slow. But if your goal is to be low and slow anyways, then it's very, very hard to detect. There's some existing tooling out here for this. I highly recommend going and checking out these two tools. Godot is a proof of concept for a simple C2, written by Leon Jacobs. I think he was at SensePost at the time. He may have moved. It's written in Go, which is awesome. Shout out Go. It has support to run any shell commands that you want, and also built-in support to grab a file and transport it over that transport method. David Middlehurst gave a really awesome talk last year, I think, at AttackCon, where he released his DoH C2 tool. It uses Cobalt Strike's external C2 module to basically extend Cobalt Strike to use an arbitrary C2 framework. In this case, he wrote it for DNS over HTTPS. There's a basic example of what a connection looks like down there. The only difference between the example I just gave is that he has his custom DNS server, so the authoritative name server, talking to his Cobalt Strike team server. But this allows Cobalt Strike and all its awesome features to be used in a transport that's pretty hard to detect. These are the two examples for malware. So Godlua backdoor was discovered by 360netlab in July. It used lots of different techniques to resolve its C2 domains, one of which was DNS over HTTPS. It actually had two examples of it. In one example, it retrieves a URL it would use for DNS over or for C2 through a DNS text record. So it didn't necessarily need to use the domain that was requested in the DNS. It was actually only looking at the TXT record to see, okay, I'm going to decode this, look at the URL, and then talk to that for C2. It also directly resolved a C2 domain over DNS over HTTPS. A really fascinating one was PSI XBot, which was Proofpoint found in early September. It resolves a fast flux C2 domain. So tons of different IPs could come out of this DNS over HTTP request that you won't be able to see. In the actual malware, it encrypted the domain with RC4, which just makes it a little more difficult for analysts to find out, but it's still doable. And all of their C2 IP addresses were using Let's Encrypt, which was actually its downfall. So since it's using Let's Encrypt, you have to show proof of you controlling the domain name. And you could look at the SNI header and the SSL request and see that all the traffic to these IP addresses involve this domain name. So once that's been shared as an IOC, you can actually just block all those, all that traffic. What it would have been really bad, and I think something that we're going to start seeing, is malware will use fast flux DNS over HTTPS, and it will use direct to IP SSL. It won't use domain names. It'll be self-signed traffic, but you won't be able to block on domain name at all because it will all be either traffic to Cloudflare or traffic direct to these IP addresses. So I see that definitely coming. So how do we defend against all these different techniques? There's a couple different options. SSL decryption is pretty much the only way to guarantee you can catch this stuff, but there are some other things you can do with J3 and J3S. You can use Security Onion and Rita. Rita is an awesome tool. And just general network and endpoint hygiene can really help you out. So when it comes to SSL decryption, it is, like I said, the only way you can guarantee you're going to be able to catch this stuff. Lots of proxies can do this. Some next-gen firewalls can do this. There are two headers used by DoH resolvers, application DNS message and application DNS JSON. If you can see this in the HTTP headers, then it's pretty much guaranteed to be DNS over HTTPS traffic. I actually just pushed an email out to the emerging threat mailing list last night that has rules to detect this, so maybe in a couple weeks that will be available and you'll start seeing logs for that. There's some really cool plugin potential here for anyone who does Zeek development. If Zeek sees those headers, then you could pretty much parse the HTTP payload and parse out what the domain request is, parse out what the response is, and be able to log that so defenders get that logging ability back. There are, of course, big downsides to man-in-the-middling SSL. TLS 1.3 is going to make this much harder and much more expensive. There's also big privacy implications. With TLS 1.3, you actually can't say don't decrypt banking, don't decrypt healthcare because of the way it's designed. So you have to pretty much go all or nothing and decrypt everything, which many organizations flat out won't be able to do. It's also, like I said, very expensive. Using J3 and J3S. So for those of you that don't know, Salesforce came out with this great tool called J3. It basically fingerprints SSL clients and servers by looking at parameters in the SSL connection. It's implemented with a simple Zeek or Bro script you can put on your sensors. I wish this was the part where I said that here's the J3 hash for DNS over HTTPS resolvers and you can block it, and that was the end. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Most of these DNS over HTTPS resolvers are sitting behind edge servers, CDN servers, HTTP termination servers, and then a separate application will handle the DNS section of it. So it's not really a good indicator for the server side hash. The client hash is still interesting. You're going to get a lot of browsers. But if you're able to correlate weird-looking clients, that's still useful, not just for detecting DNS over HTTPS, but for detecting any kind of weird malware. Here's an example I took out of a GitHub project where it talks about this architecture I just mentioned. So you have the DoH client talking to an HTTP cache server, talking to an HTTP service muxer, which is basically Apache, Nginx, Caddy. So the point there is that you'll be able to observe the traffic to Apache, and you're going to get a J3S hash matching Apache, not matching the DoH server that sits behind that. We're fortunate right now because there are some static invocators that are pretty good. DNS.google.com, Cloudflare-DNS.com. There's a bunch of other server name indicators in there, but unless they're using TLS or encrypted SNI, you're going to be able to see the server name indicator, and you can key off of that because none of those are shared between legitimate services and DNS over HTTPS resolvers. You can look at cert name. You're going to see similar stuff in there, but most of the cert names are going to be, once again, specific to a DNS over HTTPS resolver, not to something else. Also, right now, the popular resolvers use static IP addresses that aren't used for other things. So if you see traffic to 1.1.1.1, then that's most likely DNS over HTTPS traffic. You can just go ahead and block it. You don't have to worry about causing business impact by doing that. The downside to this is encrypted SNI is coming. This is a Cloudflare project to encrypt all SNI headers, so you will no longer be able to see traffic going to Cloudflare-DNS.com. You'll just see direct-to-IP traffic. GLS 1.3 will encrypt the certificate exchange, so you won't be able to key off a certificate name. And what's really scary is there's nothing in the RFC, there's nothing stopping any of these major resolvers from running on the same host as a popular website. I think for a brief period, you could actually send DNS over HTTPS requests to google.com. And so the traffic would have been to google.com, the IP address would have been a google.com IP address, and there wouldn't have been anything for defenders to key off of. Maybe they realized how bad that is and went back on it, because right now that's no longer available, but it's something that could and might happen in the future. Here's some screenshots from various GitHub projects that implement DNS over HTTPS resolvers. I wanted to show you guys these because it specifically mentions the exact thing that we're worried about. The top one, if you can't read it, says the recommended way to use a DoH proxy is to use a TLS termination proxy, a CDN, or a web server with proxying abilities as a front end. This way, the DoH service can be exposed as a virtual host sharing the same IP address as existing websites. So it's trying to get you to run it on a popular existing website. In the operational recommendations, it says DoH can be easily detected and blocked using SNI. As a mitigation, DoH endpoints should share the same virtual host as existing popular websites rather than run on dedicated virtual hosts, which, as I mentioned before, is what's currently being done. So my recommendation would basically be if you can't decrypt SSL, then you should probably be blocking DoH as much as you can. Blocking by IP works easy, and it works pretty effectively for now until someone starts running a DoH resolver on a very popular IP address. You can block by SNI, which the only downside would be once encrypted SNI starts coming out. You can block by DNS. So back when I talked about how it all works, you need that Bootstrap where you talk directly to doh.cloudflare.com. You need to ask what the IP address for that is. So since that's still within the enterprise control plane, you can just say, I want a sinkhole cloudflare-dns.com. And that'll work unless someone is hard-coding IP addresses into their C2 or their malware. You can also block by group policy, which I encourage everyone to do. This won't stop malware from talking over DNS over HTTPS, but it will limit the traffic on your network. You can block Chrome and Firefox from using DNS over HTTPS using GPO. I'll have some links at the end you can look at that show exactly how to do that. So like I mentioned before, Security Onion and Rita are awesome tools. If you're running Security Onion, then you get stuff like Zeek and Suricata, which you can use to look at those static indicators really easily. They log stuff like SNI, they log stuff like certificate name. If you're already running Zeek, you can feed that into Rita. So if you don't know, Rita is a really cool beaconing detection tool. They're at the booth here. I think there's even a Rita workshop you can try out. But it doesn't care whether your transport method is DNS over HTTPS or that you're talking to google.com. It will look at the frequency of how often you're talking to it, and it'll look for weird indicators. And so you might be able to detect beaconing by using something like Rita, which is more of a generalized detect C2 tool than detect DNS over HTTPS. The other recommendation is you have to keep your network and endpoints clean as much as you can. So if you have lockdown machines that are using GPO whitelisting or application whitelisting, and you've turned off Firefox and Chrome from talking out over DNS over HTTPS, then any traffic to those domains is bad, and you can pretty easily look into it. If you already have a good idea of all your network traffic and all your network applications, then weird J3 hashes will stick out like a sore thumb, and you can key off of those simply. My one note here is that this is really hard to do. If you have a big network, there's going to be a lot of weird stuff going on it, and having knowledge of all that's kind of difficult. So the main takeaways that I want you guys all to have is that you can use DNS over HTTPS for bad things. And if you want to inspect it to see that bad stuff, then you need to decrypt it. That's the only way you're going to be able to see what's happening. And so looking into TLS 1.3 and looking into SSL man-in-the-middling is something you should probably do. If that is not feasible for tons of reasons, which are very valid, then you should probably block it. You can block it today. It's very doable using those methods that I just mentioned. Unfortunately, it's a game of whack-a-mole, so you kind of have to stay ahead of the game and keep up to date on what the popular resolvers are and if IPs change. But that's probably the best course of action if you can't inspect it. Finally, if a major resolver goes up on a major site, like if Cloudflare decides to start running DNS over HTTPS resolvers on all of their CDN edge servers, then we're in trouble, and you better have decryption enabled. With that, I've got some resources here. My contact info is up there. Feel free to shoot me an email or follow me on Twitter. And I'll open it up for any questions anyone has.
Do you find that legal starts to freak out if you try and decrypt DoH?
Yes. Yes, so you can't just go in and say, I want to decrypt DNS over HTTPS. Instead, you have to go in and say, I want to decrypt everything on our network, including banking, including healthcare, which I'm not familiar with all the laws involved, but I know that a lot of companies purposely do not decrypt those for legal reasons. The way TLS 1.3 works is in order to tell whether or not a site is going to be banking or healthcare, you have to decrypt it. And so you've already kind of, the cat's out of the bag once you've started that decryption. And you can't say, oh, it's banking, I don't want to decrypt that. You've already started.
So for the decryption question, it seems like one of the ways to get around that potentially would be to intercept the traffic before it's encrypted, which means in the process, which would typically be some sort of EDR or sensor installation. Right. Now, you've made the point about exactly where this is handled in the browser rather than the operating system. Do you know if that includes an EDR decrypt or catchy decrypt actions as a made, or if any of those out there do that?
Right, so the question was basically about if there are tools out there that are doing this kind of decryption and monitoring on the endpoint, which I think is where a lot of this is going to go with TLS 1.3 and the stuff coming in the future. Decryption is going to have to move to the endpoint. I don't know of any specific EDRs that are currently doing that well. I know that a lot of them have it on their roadmap. I know Google is starting to look into selling Google Chrome basically enterprise as a security product and feeding in decrypted data into enterprises and all that stuff. But in general, I don't think anything does that really today. But in the future, I would definitely expect most of that decryption stuff to be happening on your endpoints.
DNS over TLS, like on your internal VPCs, is there a way to do it on like AWS Rocket or some other cloud product?
I don't know what commercial support really is for it. I've played with some open source tools you can download. So if you're like at home running a Pi-hole or something else, it's actually pretty easy to set up DNS over TLS. You can have it work. And there's no reason why companies, if they want to get all the benefits of encrypted DNS over TLS, can't start having their internal resolvers run on it and having their clients support it. It is taking the control plane back into the area of the network operators, which is why DNS over HTTPS came to be, because basically adoption was quite slow. And Google looked at it and was like, well, we can just push DNS over HTTPS to Chrome and set up our own resolver, and then it's done. Then we have however many million people using it. But yeah, there's nothing stopping you from setting it up. I don't know of any commercial level products, but I do know that there are some open source ones.
So you mentioned that the protocol bootstraps over the 453 DNS by looking up some specific resolver names. Now,
I don't think that any of the people running legitimate DoH stuff have been talking about doing direct to IP, because their goal is to prevent censorship and prevent people from snooping your DNS queries. So if your only DNS query is to resolver, that's not necessarily what they're trying to hide. They're trying to hide the DNS queries they're sending to the actual resolver. I know that we will definitely see malware going direct to IP. And kind of tangentially related to that, I know that there's been talks of just sending a ton of DNS records down to browsers. We're talking like a couple megabyte file with most of the popular websites in it, pretty much getting around DNS entirely. But if you're interested in that, I recommend Googling around. Cool. Well, I'll be around the conference. My name's Marcus. I'm very approachable. Feel free to talk to me about any of this stuff. I'll be around here. Yeah, come to me with any questions. Thank you all for coming.